Thank you very much, Tom. I'm very happy to be here. I'm just about to go back home in a week, and it's a wonderful way to conclude my stay in Berkeley. That's how I feel. Can you hear me well? No, you can't. Let's figure out why. Okay, better now? Okay. So before I begin, I just want to say that I'm not going to really discuss the items that I asked you to read and watch, and I do hope that you had the opportunity to have a real discussion on those items with your GSIs. I think they merit a lengthier discussion than the kind of discussion that we will lead here, but I will allude to them. I will allude to the work of Tom Keenan. I will allude to the work of Peter Redfield, but as I said, I won't discuss them very elaborately. What I will do is to try to provide with a broader context that will help you make sense of the general issues that come up in the articles that I asked you to read and in the film A Cry from the Grave, with some kind of a general context that will help you to think about the general question that will concern us today, which is basically what is witnessing, and more specifically, what is humanitarian witnessing. So, as I said, we're dealing today with one of the fundamental practices in the field of human rights work and human rights activism. And what I want to speak about more specifically is on humanitarian witnessing and the range of ethical and political issues that surround it. Now, human rights discourse and humanitarian discourse are replete with references to witnessing and with instances of witnessing. Human rights claims, as you probably know, rely on, or one can even say that they are practically made of the stories that victims tell about their predicaments. The way in which human rights activists proceed in order to construct their broader claims, in order to construct broader stories on political persecution, is often to collect testimonies from victims, from the survivors of human rights abuses, from people who have experienced, who were subject to human rights violations. And then human rights activists often proceed by showcasing those testimonies in the reports that they published and in the campaigns that they lead, either on a particular case of a group that was persecuted or on a broader human rights issue. So this is the form of human rights, of witnessing in the domain of human rights and humanitarianism that we're most familiar with. But I would like to claim that there's another form that witnessing takes in the domain of human rights and humanitarian work. And I'm referring to the kind of witnessing that activists see themselves as performing. Because very often today, human rights and humanitarian activists refer, or they frame and justify their own practices in terms of witnessing. For them, witnessing is something that they perform in order to protect victims, and not only something that victims do. And when human rights and humanitarian activists relate to their own practices in terms of witnessing, they usually do not refer to the stories that they tell about their own experiences, about things that happen to them. Rather, what they think about when they refer to their own practices in terms of witnessing is to the things that happen to others that they wish to protect by telling stories about their predicament, by bearing witness to their condition. Now, in this context, or for human rights and humanitarian activists, bearing witness is considered to be both a strategic choice and an ethical obligation. Strategic choice in the sense that it is considered to be an effective course of action. it is considered to be an action that can put a halt to human rights violations. But as I said, witnessing is not just a strategic choice, because witnessing is also referred to very often as an ethical obligation, in the sense that witnessing is considered to be something that human rights activists and humanitarian activists, but also anyone who is confronted with human rights violation, should do. This is the very least that we should do when we are confronted with human rights violations. Witnessing is the very least that we should do. Now, this perception of witnessing as both a strategic choice and an ethical obligation is something that is not shared only by human rights activists. As I said, it is also something that humanitarian activists are very engaged in. It is also something that solidarity groups rely on. It is also something that social activists would rely on from time to time. So there's a broad range of non-governmental actors, but also of journalists, photographers, journalists, photographers, even anthropologists, who use witnessing as a kind of a semantic umbrella that describes what they feel compelled to do in the face of human rights violations. Now, those professional groups that I just mentioned believe that their own practices of witnessing are imbricated in what should be a more general state of a heightened sensibility to other people's plight. So, as they see it, they bear witness for the public at large. In the sense, for example, that their own largely unofficial mandate is based on the presumed interest of the public in learning about and in acting upon morally troubling issues. But also in the sense that from their point of view, they publicize their certified facts and their certified stories on distant atrocities in an attempt to sensitize the public and to, in a way, turn audiences into witnesses. So, as you can see, there's some kind of a circularity at work here. On the one hand, the public is perceived as the basis for humanitarian witnessing, but at the same time, the public is also perceived as the result of acts of witnessing by human rights and humanitarian activists. But the reason why I bring up this issue of the public and its relation to witnessing at that point is that it is important for me to stress the salience of witnessing in our general culture of human rights. Because in many respects, witnessing is something that we are all expected to do. We are all expected to become witnesses to human rights violations, even if, and especially when, those violations do not concern us personally. So there are many things to be said about our general culture of witnessing, about the kind of moral obligation that witnessing imposes on each one of us. But as I said, today I will focus on the practice of witnessing by human rights and humanitarian activists. And the question that I would like to examine with you today is the following. What do activists refer to when they invoke witnessing as one of the principles and as one of the frameworks of their practice? What is witnessing for them? In what does the act of witnessing consist? When we talk about human rights and humanitarian witnessing, are we actually talking about another form of eyewitnessing? Is this kind of witnessing basically about producing first-person accounts that describe events from the point of view of the activist who have been on the spot and had a first-hand experience of distant emergencies? Now, today, I will try to argue that the answer to that question, what is witnessing for human rights and humanitarian activists, that the answer to that question is not straightforward. I will claim that the notion of witnessing to atrocities by third parties, such as human rights and humanitarian activists, is not just prevalent today, but also rather obscure. Because in the sphere of human rights and humanitarian activism, there are competing versions of what witnessing means and entails. In other words, witnessing is a rather fuzzy concept, an even controversial concept. But, and this is a crucial point, as I will argue later on, this fuzziness is more of an opportunity than of a problem. Because, as I will try to convince you, this inability to settle on one single definition of witnessing, and the fact that there is more than one legitimate meaning that one can ascribe to witnessing is precisely what turns witnessing into a critical activity. This is precisely what makes witnessing such an ethically potent response to distant suffering. So, my aim today is to explore what witnessing, when it is performed by humanitarian and human rights activists, means beyond its immediate connotations. I will start by addressing those immediate connotations of witnessing, but then in the second part of my lecture, I will focus on the practices of witnessing of just one prominent non-governmental humanitarian organization, and this organization is Médecins Sans Frontières. That's the French name, Doctors Without Borders in English, and I will often use the acronym MSF to refer to that organization. MSF was founded in 1971 in France. It grew to be a multinational movement during the 1990s, and it specializes in delivering medical assistance in emergencies. Now, the reason why I want to focus on MSF is because its members and volunteers have always considered witnessing as one of the major tasks. And they've always dealt very explicitly with the meaning of witnessing and with the challenges that witnessing entails. But I think that the issues that will come up in our discussion today are relevant to the understanding of witnessing in a broader field of humanitarian and human rights work.
Question?
Yes.
We had the students read Primo Levi, who's always thought to be a great witness to the Holocaust, and it's first-person witnessing. Are you excluding first-person witnessing for a reason?
I'm not sure that I'm excluding first-person witnessing. I just don't want our perception of witnessing to be overly influenced by this very common and very well-known form of witnessing. I just want us together to make an effort to think about witnessing otherwise. And I just don't want this very central notion of witnessing as a survivor who comes up and tells his story or her story. I don't want it to interfere in the kind of different and critical interpretation of witnessing that I would like to elaborate, on which I would like to elaborate here today. Okay, so I would like to begin by, as I said, by addressing the conventional meanings of witnessing in the domain of humanitarian and human rights work. And as you probably know, there are some references that immediately come to mind when witnessing is invoked by humanitarian and human rights activists. Witnessing is often linked with